Well, friends, once again, thanks for joining us for Cultivating Ideas today. This is our final in the series for the fall here, and we're grateful for your time today. We have the privilege today to have Reverend Dr. Margaret Aymer, who has joined us to teach on the Ethiopian eunuch. Dr. Aymer has been teaching New Testament since 2001 and joined the faculty at APTS in 2015. She teaches core courses on the introduction to the New Testament, exegesis in Greek, and elective courses in numerous disciplines, including African Americans in the Bible, and feminist and womanist biblical interpretations. She became academic dean in 2022, the first woman and the first person of color to hold that position. Today's topic, again, who was the Ethiopian eunuch? In Acts 8, we read about the Ethiopian eunuch, an unnamed pilgrim to Jerusalem, who appears in Luke's story of the church and then disappears after an encounter with Philip. Who was the Ethiopian eunuch, and how does this role fit into the story of faith? This Bible story takes us through the story of the eunuch as a story of exile, slavery, homecoming, and the witness of the early church. So, Dr. Aymer, we turn it over to you.
What you think is going on in the story. Ready? So the beginning of the story reads, first memory, the fireworks on New Year's with Dad. School, meeting my best friend. Years later in college, meeting her. Wedding. Birth of Josie, her first birthday. Second child, Kathy. All memories flashing. Last one, car's hood, the surprised driver. So, in the chat, what happened in that story? What was that story about? Growing up in life experiences, brief headlines of life, someone's life flashing before their eyes, life lived in relationship with others, remembering, dramatic change, abrupt ending, dramatic change with an accident, memories. So already we're lots of different ways of interpreting that story, right? We could read it as a suicide. We could read it as a dream sequence related to one's therapist. We could read it as a parent or a caregiver telling a doctor about a loved one's PTSD. It could be notes for a film actor reading the description of a scene, or someone describing a scene at a movie scene at the TV or movie scene at the water cooler. How can so few words conjure so many backstories to make sense of one little set of stories? See, here's the thing. Interpreting a story, and I'm going to find a way to close this chat. Interpreting a story is like doing a jigsaw puzzle. It's like doing a jigsaw puzzle without a picture to guide you. We make our meaning from context, our context, and the context of the world around us. Our context affects what we think a story means. If the author we're reading doesn't provide us a context or assumes that their audience understands the context, then you, me, the reader, we provide it in our mind, sometimes unconsciously. So two readers reading the same story, one may see a suicide, one may see a car accident. One may see a film score. Reconstructing the background of a story and the narrative order of events is called fabulation. The reader or hearer is just filling in the gaps, just as you did in that little piece of Twitter fiction written by Thaddeus June. So the first thing I want to say is fabulation is a completely normal part of the way we make sense of a story. We cannot possibly, when you're writing, write down every little detail of a story. The author has to assume some familiarity from the audience about what's going on and that the audience will fill in the context. But because the context is never fully filled in, our fabulation, the way we reconstruct a story in our mind, can become skewed by our biases and by our experiences of the world. And so we have to always think about and check how we reconstruct a story, what our fabulation is about a story. So in today's webinar, we're going to look at fabulation in the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, and specifically how we reconstruct the story of the eunuch in our brain, the context we put to it, how that affects our interpretation of Acts chapter 8, verses 26 to 39. We'll also explore what other story might be told about this Ethiopian. And then finally, we'll start talking about how we fabulate a story, how we tell a story and construct a story, why that matters to you as Christians and ministerial leaders. So here's the story of Acts 8, 26 to 39 in a nutshell. Philip, who was a diasporan Jewish convert to Christianity and a deacon of the early church, is, as Phil said, teleported by an angel of the Lord to Gaza. Yes, that Gaza. There he encounters a chariot carrying an Ethiopian eunuch returning from worshiping in Jerusalem, and the eunuch is reading a scroll of Isaiah. He joins the chariot and begins a conversation about the book of Isaiah. And after their conversation, the Ethiopian eunuch asks what prevents him to be baptized. Philip baptizes the Ethiopian, who returns home with joy. The story is pretty straightforward, yes? But for many interpreters, it raises this important question. Who is this Ethiopian? And that, friends, is where the fabulation begins. You see, my fellow interpreters have all sorts of ideas about who this guy is, who this guy must be. Here are some examples. The standard majority fabula constructed for this story, the way that the story is fabulated or reconstructed, is the story of the rejected pagan Gentile. In this story, the Ethiopian eunuch goes up to Jerusalem to worship in the temple. However, he is rejected from being a proselyte or convert to Judaism, or even from worshiping in the temple because he is a eunuch. On his way home, reading a scripture he does not understand, he finds acceptance with the good Christian missionary Philip. Now, just on the chat, has anyone of you ever heard or read this interpretation or used this interpretation in a sermon or in a Bible study? Nobody? Okay, I see one chat. Okay, Monica has. Anybody else? Okay, Sarah Allen has. Anybody else? Okay, not that I remember. So Aiden has. Okay. Okay. Cool. Now, African American interpreters, oh, there's some more chats coming in. Yeah, something like it. African American interpreters have added to this fabula. They point out that the man is in a chariot and is the treasurer of the ruler of Merowe, the Kandake. So clearly he's a man of wealth and power. Indeed, some have pointed out that he clearly outranks Philip, the deacon. Further, African American interpreters have underscored that the Ethiopian must be black, which many earlier white male European interpreters simply overlooked. This was part of the project of recovering the black presence in the Bible. So the story now is that a powerful, wealthy black Gentile eunuch from Merowe, the representative of a rival kingdom to Rome, is rejected by Jerusalem but welcomed by the good Christian missionary. How about that kind of fabulation? Has anybody ever read or heard or used that fabulation before? Adding the aspect of blackness to it. Okay. Okay. So we got some yeses here. I see some yeses coming. Okay. Now, queer scholars and those who do disability, or as they have put it, crip studies, have also weighed in on the Ethiopian. Queer folks, noting his castration, claim him as part of the genderqueer community. Disabled scholars claim that his castration renders him part of the disabled community. So now we have the story of a rich, queer, disabled, powerful Black Gentile going up to Jerusalem to worship, being rejected, coming home, and then being welcomed and baptized by the Christian missionary. So that sound familiar to people? Okay. No, but I like it. Okay. So then, if that is the fabulation we use for this story, what difference does it make? Well, this is what I wrote in an article published this year in the Journal of Biblical Literature. This reconstructed narrative cannot help but depict Jerusalem and the Judaism for which that city is a cipher as homophobic, xenophobic, and racist, while making the Christian evangelist the hero of a story of first-century queer Black Gentile inclusion. So what's the problem with this fabulation? What stereotypes does this reconstruction perpetuate? What underlying story does it reveal that is embedded in United States, even our Christian, even Christian progressive lenses? Are we as Christians responsible for perpetuating the stereotype that Judaism is necessarily homophobic, xenophobic, and racist? Are we as Christians guilty of perpetuating the stereotype that only the Christian evangelist would welcome this Ethiopian into the worshiping community? Is that the story we want to be telling from our pulpits and in our Bible studies? Today, I want to propose an alternative way to read this story, and it begins by going back to the text itself, and I promise we're not doing Greek today. First, we know that the man works for the Kandake, or ruler of Meroe, an African kingdom to the south. This man is identified as an Ethiopian, but that's an identification of place and ethnicity. It's not necessarily an identification of belief. Luke tells us that this man had gone up to Jerusalem to worship. A very peculiar activity for a pagan, to be sure. And that's all that Luke tells us. We actually don't know what happened in Jerusalem. We certainly cannot say that he was rejected by the Jerusalem temple or by Jewish worshipers. We don't even know that he went to the temple. We know that there were diaspora synagogues in Jerusalem because we hear about them in Acts 7. Luke does not tell us where this man goes other than he went to Jerusalem to worship. So part of the way we're fabulating the story is we're filling in details that aren't there. And then our third clue is the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, a book considered holy to Jews and Christians, but not necessarily to pagans. And this is a man who was reading the scroll, suggesting that he was literate, at least in Hebrew or Greek. So what do we make of these three clues? Well, what context might bring Meroe, Jerusalem, and a scroll of Isaiah together? Any ideas? Here's one suggestion. This map from Princeton University shows where Jewish refugees fled after the fall of the first temple. And the circled area with the arrow pointing south here along the Nile is the direction from which the Ethiopian comes and to which the Ethiopian returns. So if this man was descended from the Jews who were dispersed south down the Nile into Meroe and beyond, it would make complete sense that he was in Meroe, that he, as a Jew, descended from Jews, was going to Jerusalem to worship and returning home, and that he was reading from a Jewish scripture because he's a diasporan Jew. If we begin by affirming that this man was not a Gentile, not a pagan, but in fact a diasporan Jew, this makes him like Philip. And like the other deacons from Acts 7, like the synagogues of Acts 2, and like those gathered at Pentecost, the synagogues of Acts 6, and those gathered in Pentecost at Acts 2. These three clues suggest that this man, I'm going to give you a different fabulation, could have been born into that diaspora Jewish community, circumcised on the 8th day as a boy, raised to read the scriptures as a boy. And we don't know how often he had traveled to Jerusalem, but that is unremarkable activity if the man is a devout and practicing Jew. And now let's talk about the word eunuch. It's a critical word because Luke repeats it in the story 5 times. It is the most repeated word in the story. The word eunuch points to 2 other background realities. First, the word eunuch indicates that our Ethiopian man is enslaved. Castration was only performed on those who were enslaved, those who had no bodily autonomy, those who could not protect their own body. The way this works is fairly commonly known. Boys who showed intelligence and beauty would have been taken and castrated so that they could not impregnate any royal women. And then they could then grow up to be powerful officials in the royal court without being any threat to the royal line, but they were still enslaved. What this suggests is we have to read our Ethiopian as a victim of sexual violence, probably sexual violence entirely against his will as a minor. Enslaved boys rarely had any choice in the sexual violence perpetrated on them. This suggests that the Ethiopian is not queer or transgender because human sexual orientation and human gender diversity are naturally occurring phenomena. They are not necessarily engendered by sexual violence. As a castrati, a eunuch, he would have borne both the marks of his circumcision and his castration in his genital area. And one commentator that I read said, well, he couldn't have become a Jew because they would have seen the marks of his castration and they wouldn't have then circumcised him. That's assuming you're going from castration to circumcision rather than from circumcision to castration. Now, none of this takes away from the man's position as the treasurer of the ruler of Meroe the Kandake. He could still have become her treasurer and be her slave. He could be both her treasurer and her treasure. Neither does it take away that he looks like a black-skinned Ethiopian. Jews were not and are not universally pale-skinned people. Zephaniah the prophet was probably Cushite. Further, if his family were enslaved, we should recognize that children of the enslaved often begin to look like their masters because their mothers also have no bodily autonomy and thus no sexual autonomy. So it's very possible, either because of the rape of his mother or because he simply came from black people, that you got a black Jew. And then we have the story of a rich, black, powerful Ethiopian Jewish eunuch going up to Jerusalem to worship and coming home reading a scroll of Isaiah. When interpretation is offered, he accepts it. That's a very common response in Judaism, because you read together, you interpret together. There's a whole Jewish practice called havrata, where you make sense of the text in pairs. Then Philip preaches to him the Christian message. He believes it and asks to be baptized. So isn't that a far-fetched fabulation? Well, we do have at least one other biblical model of such a person who is possibly a eunuch and definitely reading and a devout Jew. His name is Daniel, and he was in the Persian court. Now, early ancient commentators frequently read Daniel and his companions as eunuchs in the court of the king, and portrayed Daniel as beardless. Yet no one doubts Daniel's Jewishness, even though he was also a Jewish exile, certainly enslaved, likely castrated, literate, and devout. There's even one scene in Daniel 9 where he is reading a book, he's reading a scroll, and is given guidance about how to understand what's going on by Gabriel the angel himself. Hebrew Bible scholar Carol Newsom writes this about that scene. Daniel is represented as reading in private, consulting a book in order to understand the intentions of God. The only close biblical parallel is the much later scene in Acts 8:26-40, where the Ethiopian eunuch is reading and pondering a passage from Isaiah. So where are we now with our fabulation? The reading I am proposing, this reading, fits the larger narrative of the beginning of Acts, a narrative of the ingathering of God's dispersed people. The Ethiopian Jews' conversion marks an ending to Luke's tale of diaspora and ingathering, so that with the next story, Luke can begin the story of Gentile conversion that will occupy the remainder of his narrative. Just remember Luke's story of Acts so far. In Acts 2, diaspora Jews hear the gospel in their own language. In Acts 6, diaspora Jews are called to be deacons. In Acts 7, synagogues of diaspora Jews accuse Stephen, a diaspora Jew, of blasphemy. In Acts 8, Philip, a diaspora Jew, converts Samaritans, also a kind of diaspora Jew, and then Philip goes to Gaza. And so why have interpreters so often imagined this exilic Jew as a pagan? Well, we call this process exoticization, treating a people or culture as utterly different from you, exotic and strange. Now, we don't always do this out of meanness or racism, but sometimes we do it out of simple unfamiliarity. If, for instance, all the Jews you have ever known are white and of European descent, you might immediately assume that an Ethiopian cannot possibly also be a Jew. And that affects your fabulation. If you discount that as a possibility at the outset, you can't possibly read him that way. One way to think about exoticization is that it is telling a single story about a people, rather than telling multiple different stories. It's a single stream story rather than a complex story. In her viral TED Talk, novelist Chimamanda Adichie put it like this: show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. So with the Ethiopian, what we are doing is showing a people as one thing, pagans, and only one thing, over and over again. And that story is incomplete. And that word Ethiopian was that exotic word for many interpreters and pastors and ministerial leaders and faithful Northern European Christians. It was based on the assumption that Ethiopian meant African. It could not also mean Jewish. But what if it does? What if there's more than one story to tell? What if there's more than one way to tell the story? And so my questions for you all is, what other fabulations are you finding yourself talking about in the Bible? What other stories could you tell? What other stories should you tell? What questions should you be asking? And I am open to any of your comments or questions or discussion about what I have just shared.
As we've done in the past, friends, you can type your question in the chat if you don't have the ability to say it out loud, and I'm happy to read it for you, or feel free to just come off mute, or you can raise your hand if that's easier for you as well, but we welcome questions.
I'll throw out a question. I'm wondering what kind of fabulation we might do for Philip. I've long wanted my superpower to be teleportation, so now I have a biblical hero for that. But what else do we know about him, and what else could we imagine about him?
That's a great question. So there are some things we know for sure. We know his name is Philip. Philippos is a Greek name, right? So he at least has a Greek name. That doesn't necessarily mean he is Greek in ethnicity, because Johannan Marcos has a Greek name. And Simeon Petros has a Greek name. But we know that he is identified as one of the deacons and one of the Hellenistic Jews. So Hebrew was probably not his first language. So he may even have been one of the converts in Acts 2 who heard the gospel in his own language from all over the diaspora world. And if you read that story, that's a whole map of the Mediterranean. And it contains Africa, it contains Asia, it contains Europe. So Philip can look like anyone, be from anywhere. We know he can speak to Samaritans, so he may or may not know Aramaic. We also know Samaritans read Greek. So we have lots of ways we can imagine Philip. But if you think back to that picture of Rembrandt that Rembrandt did of Philip baptizing the eunuch, Rembrandt has him as an old white guy from Germany. And he could look like that, but he doesn't have to look like that, right? We can begin to say, well, what can we imagine about a man of that generation who would have been a leader at that time, who is a Jew, right? But is not a Jew from Israel. He's a Jew from the diaspora.
Laura says, I wonder when the Jewish tradition of desiring multiple interpretations of scripture to demonstrate the vastness of God left the tradition of Christian interpretation. We miss out on so much by limiting our interpretations. How can we do better at introducing this process in our churches?
So there are first of all, that's a great question, Laura. And I think you're right about that. There are good resources out there on using teaching like Havrata, where you learn to do study in pairs. There are great resources out there on contextual Bible study where you are, yes, Thank you, Phil. Where contextual Bible study, where you work together as a group to come to how a text might mean for you, for your context. And I think the work of learning together and having multiple interpretations is partially the study work of the pastor, but it's also the way the pastor encourages the congregation to engage the text and to look at the text. And what do you think this means? Or what do you hear? What do you see? And we don't do that nearly as much as we used to. How does the way that I laid this story out change the way you would preach this text now? How would you preach it differently? If you would preach it differently at all. If you're not mad at me. Wow, I shut them up. They have nothing to say.
Well, I'll share something. So Dr. Aymer and I have had some conversations about this as she was writing her article. One of the things that clearly comes to mind, I think because it reflects current concerns among progressive pastors to preach about Christianity in ways that don't denigrate the Judaism that Jesus grew up in. This becomes another way of saying that this shall we say, distinctive and odd individual, he was Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And I probably might push it and say he was going to his temple in Jerusalem. It becomes a way of expanding what it was like to be Jewish in the ancient world. And so that is an interesting, to me, it's kind of a new insight.
That's great. And Laura says, I think the fact that the word eunuch is repeated 5 times should certainly make us focus on the meaning of that more. That's right. We don't think enough about the pain this man has lived through, right? We don't think enough about the fact that in the exile, Hezekiah is told his children will be made eunuchs. And this man has read that part of Isaiah already, right? That's back in Isaiah 39. So he understands what that means to be cut off. He understands what that means to be isolated. He comes from an exilic people. What does it mean to read the story of exiles that way? Do we have exiles among us still today? Do we have people who have fled the kinds of violence that exiles face? How is this text good news for them? Rick, I see your hand.
Yes, I think that were I to preach this text, I would I think what you've shown me is that I would need to look from different perspectives. It's not just from the perspective of Philip or of the author, Luke, or even of the eunuch. I would need to look at all of their perspectives,
Mm-hmm.
and how they are interacting from their perspective, and do more research on what the possibilities are, as you obviously have done in presenting us with what are the circumstances of their lives, what are the possibilities of the circumstances of their lives, and how does that change the narrative in a way that can bring more relevance to the story in today's world.
Thanks. I mean, one of the things I think about when I think about the eunuch as a victim of sexual violence is victims of sexual violence asking, am I too damaged to be part of the church? right? You think about those who have survived childhood abuse, those who have survived adult abuse and rape, coming to the pastor and saying, where can I find hope? Where can I see that I can be welcomed? Am I damaged goods? And similarly, those who have survived, disability, can I still be a full member of this congregation? Can I still be a full member of this church? And we can do that with the Ethiopian without making this a fault of Judaism.
Yes, yes, we don't have to find someone to blame.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Does it change the role of conversion, recognizing if he is coming from a Jewish background as opposed to a Gentile background? And then does that change the role of baptism as well that takes place?
Right. So coming from the conversion here is similar to what happens in Acts. This is the Jew who is accepting Jesus as Messiah. This is not what happens in Acts 10 when Cornelius, who is a God-fearer and a proselyte, but not circumcised, so does not follow the whole law. One presumes that this is a man who goes to Jerusalem to worship and is reading the scroll. He's probably a law-abiding Jew. So this is a different story than the Cornelius story, which happens in 10. And one of the things you'll read a lot of commentators saying is, well, this is really the first Gentile convert, but he doesn't have to deal with baptism. He doesn't have to deal with circumcision because he couldn't be circumcised because he was castrated, which is like different organ of the body, people. Not the same thing at all. Right? And that's a way to kind of tie yourself in knots about it rather than saying, this is an extreme example of what can happen to people who are in exile. People who are in exile, who still are connected to this temple, who still worship the God of their ancestors, who are still faithful Jews, can be castrated, can look like the other people that they live in, can live very far away. But the same gospel that's preached in Acts 2 to them is preached also to and accepted, is also acceptable and accepts these people who are living in the far off lands to the ends of the earth. Wow, look at that's an amazing comment, Laura. Laura writes in the chat, I had a college student in Romania who'd been told by her Orthodox priest that she was not even worthy to read the Bible because of her sin. The damage done to sinners by other sinners is so sad, and we must do better to help people find ways to connect to the liberating and power and truth of Scripture. Hey, Ezekiel. Unmute yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Aymer, so much for the abundance of gifts you bestowed upon us. A couple things when I sing the hymn "O Come Emmanuel," I break down usually because I always remember it. Of course, I have lived here more than any place else. I mean, even in the home country where I was born, but the culture wants to remind you often that you're here, but you're not part of it.
Right.
And I think we're talking about disabilities and Miss Laura talking about her student in Romania. I had a parishioner which he was constantly told by his family that he was not worthy because he had a drug addiction problem. And he's a grown man, 55 years of age, and he broke down crying, and I said, you are worthy because of what God through Jesus did for you. And I think the good news for us, those who are evangelists or those who claim to be disciples of the good Lord, is to open the table and open the gates. And one of the things that I keep saying is the Hollywood folks, because they are beautiful and handsome and have fame and money, until tragedy knocks upon their door, and then they realize that whatever they have is not enough.
Mm-hmm. You've muted yourself, Ezekiel.
I'm sorry. I keep saying that the good news that we have is like nothing else. And whether you're rich or poor, beautiful or not so beautiful, there is always good news. And I think we have to embody that and really believe it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it makes sense more for folks. Of course, I'm not going to sing, but I'm just going to read. Is Elvis Presley has a son. I'm not of that time, but I have heard the song. Walk a mile in my shoes, just walk a mile in my shoes. And before you abuse me, criticize, and accuse me, just walk a mile in my shoes.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
That's such a refreshing news. And again, if we go back to Ephesians, talking about, before you're a foreigner, before you're alien, before you are immigrant, before, but now you are part of the people of God. Now you have a seat at the table. I am telling you, there's nothing like that news when you have been excluded or being told that you don't belong.
Right.
I cannot tell you how meaningful those words are when you are open, when you are welcome to a table which you have been previously excluded from.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm preaching.
You are. But you're preaching well. How about others? We only have a few more minutes. How does this change your perception of Jews in the New Testament? How does this affect the way you see the people that we think of or talk about as Jews in the New Testament?
Margaret.
Yes, Rick.
So, and I'm sorry there's a glare behind me,
That's okay.
um, so I was raised in an evangelical theology, and the Jewish people were always seen as the enemy,
Mm-hmm.
the ones who rejected Christ, so forth and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reality is that they were just following their faith, and they weren't whether just be those that did not accept Christ as the Messiah. That didn't make them evil.
Mm-hmm.
That was just who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't, they never get into what it was, because it was planned for Jesus to die on the cross. So it was like the Jews that killed Jesus, but it was the Roman state.
Right.
He was tried and convicted for a crime against the state of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it wasn't the Jewish people as a whole. And this, that did something evil. And I took a course at seminary, Jesus and the rabbis. And it was taught by Louis. And and it wasn't that necessarily that the Pharisees were evil and out to get Jesus. But one possibility that Louis presented was maybe it was just part of the midrash. It was just part of that debating that Jewish rabbis do with each other, and that Jewish leaders do. Um, I learned that in the Jewish faith, the answers are unimportant. It's the questions that are important.
Mhm.
And so maybe that's what was going on, and it wasn't as
Right.
conflictual, and it wasn't as antagonistic as we've been, or at least as I had been taught to believe that it was. And so I think, you presented that in this
Mhm.
presentation analysis of the story, that, each group or each person, each character is acting from their experience,
Mhm.
and not necessarily with an evil intent.
Right. Well, and the thing that's fascinating to me is how much has been built up in the story about him being rejected at the temple.
Yes.
When Luke literally says nothing about it.
Uh-huh.
I mean, literally no thing. He was
Uh-huh.
returning from the temple. He had
Yes.
gone up to
Yes.
worship and was returning. That is all that Luke says.
Uh-huh.
And so you wonder, what is it that what are the blanks that we are filling in? Going back to that first story I shared, right? What are the
Yes.
blanks that we are filling in that allow us, that compel us to assert that he went up to the temple and was rejected? Maybe he went up to the temple and was accepted, but was just compelled by the message of Philip. Maybe it was
Mm-hmm.
not a choice between a bad and a good, but between something that he loved and cherished and something that he found fulfilled the heart of what he loved and cherished.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, why do we make it a rivalry? Right?
Yeah.
Sometimes
Uh-huh.
it's a rivalry in the text, but sometimes it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And for Luke, in this case, that's not the issue. Tim mentions there's also no one phenotype of Jews.
Yes.
We say that all the time, but we sometimes forget it. We talk about Bible pictures and Bible movies, and it's amazing how many Bible movies have, slightly toasted skin.
Mm-hmm.
Folks have slightly, they maybe sat out in the sun a little bit. They might get as dark as Ezekiel.
Mm-hmm.
Lightly toasted. Start in Isaiah to get to the good news in the short span time of a ride. Wonder where he was in Isaiah. Yes, so Laura is asking a great question about where the Ethiopian, what was the Ethiopian actually reading in Isaiah? And Luke actually tells us that. I have to pull up the text to find it. But I was afraid I had too much material, not too little, so I didn't put it in to my presentation. Luke actually tells us in Acts 8:26 that he read the part, like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open its mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth. Now, if you were castrated as a child, what do you hear in that? Do you not hear your own story? Do you not hear the text speaking about something you have personally experienced? Like a sheep, he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb, silent before his shearer, so he does not open his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For life, his life is taken from the earth. This is a man who will never be able to father a child, which in that world is a problem. He has been cut off. And this process of empires sterilizing people against their will has never stopped. Hasn't even stopped in this country. People have been doing that in this country. Women go in thinking they're getting medical help and find out they've been sterilized. You know, so he understands this. That's where he is in the text, Laura. And you can see how Philip then would have taken that story and tied his experience of being humiliated, cut off, to Jesus's experience. Another Jew, another person that with whom he would relate, but one that Philip holds to be the Messiah. And you can see why that would be good news to this man. Might he hear his community in that story? If you are exiled and enslaved, right? You have been exiled, led out of your home like sheep to a slaughter. Justice has been denied you. Your life has been taken from the earth. People don't even people don't even believe that you exist. He may hear his whole community in that. He says to Philip, who do you think the text is talking about here? Let's jump in. Let's talk. Let's engage.
I don't have it in front of me either, but what do you make of does he say there's no one to explain it to me?
Right.
Isn't that what it?
Yeah.
What do you make of that aspect of it in the text too?
Well, I think we come from a society in which understanding is to be done internally by ourselves. We value the person that can digest the story by themselves and come up with their own answers. But he and Daniel and many others understood understanding and scholarship as something that's done in conversation with each other. Understanding is something that comes from explanation and dialogue and reason, not just from me reading on my own. This is, I see Bill asking himself, this is what he does in his classes. He gets students to have conversation about difficult texts together, and the conversation is what illuminates the text. I saw the note what you said, Laura, about a note in the study Bible that Philip might have directed him to Isaiah 56, or not. You see, that's the thing. We are trying so hard to try to figure out what Philip is saying about this man because we haven't dealt with the fact that he's castrated to begin with. And what that implies about who he is. One of the people that was really helpful to me in writing this story was Chanel Smith. And Chanel wrote about the woman Babylon. It was Chanel who pointed out that she is both enslaved and powerful at the same time. We have a hard time with that you can be both enslaved and powerful at the same time. And again, we have this fabulation where if you're powerful, you can't be enslaved. And if you're enslaved, you can't be powerful.
Yes, Doctor. I'm having a hard time shying away from Bonhoeffer, but I'm going to get closer by quoting Martin Niemöller. And when he talks about the poem, first they came for the communists and I did not speak out. And again, not because we are not the group that has been targeted for a particular injustice, that means that I will not sometime down the road be the target of that vitriol that is being unleashed upon a particular group of people because of who they are, so on and so forth. So again, is standing with those who are abused, even though you have not been abused yourself. And I think Dr. Martin Luther King said, you know, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, something like that.
We have about 3 minutes left. I have a question. How did they know he was a eunuch? Luke mentions it 7 times. What's the clue that he was a eunuch? Omniscient. It could be the omniscient narrator. Male in the court? What do you mean by that, Tony?
The fact that he's serving in a court and he may be close to the women, and so that proximity.
The other thing that there would have been a sure sign is that he would have been beardless, because he would not have gone through male puberty. The removal of the testes would have had impact on his hormonal production. And just like when you neuter a cat or a dog, it changes its physiology. It also does for humans. So he would have been visibly different looking. And so this is where I think the queer reading is very helpful to remember that even though this person would not necessarily have identified as transgender or identified as queer, because this is not a choice he made or this is not an identity he claims, he still would have been in some way queered in the society. That does not mean, again, from the text, that he was rejected. But he would have been visibly different. And I think that gets at the question, what is to prevent me from being baptized? Because he knows that Philip can see that he's a eunuch. His voice may not have dropped as much. His face may be beardless. He knows what Philip can see and can perceive. Yep, visibly different, Crystal. But the visible difference is not his skin color. And that is the piece we need to remember.
Final questions, anyone? As we just hit 1 o'clock. But if anybody has a final question, we'll leave the space. Well, Dr. Aymer, this has been enlightening and made me want to go research eunuchs more, because like you said, if it's said 7 times in there, I feel like there's a worthy opportunity here to dive deeper into understanding what the role of the eunuch was in the scriptures. So thank you for inviting us to fabulation and to think imaginatively and creatively even. This has been very enlightful. So everybody just handshake, wave, give a big congratulations. Thank you to Dr. Aymer. We really appreciate this. And again, we hope that you'll take a little bit of time here to fill out our survey. It's in the chat there. And I'll drop the link one more time. We have our spring lineup coming up as well. It is all on the website, and you can see that whole lineup. They're active, as well as you can register as well. So we're really grateful for your time today and throughout all of the fall. This has been a great series. We're really, truly grateful. And Dr. Aymer, for all the faculty, we're truly grateful for the time and for the continued learning we get as well. So blessings to you all, and a blessed Advent as we go forward as well. Go in peace.